Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unraveling a pretty profound historical mystery from the Second World War. We so often think of wars being won by singular, flashy battlefield tactics or some massive breakthrough weapon. But today, we're actually looking at something much more systemic, something completely invisible, and frankly, I think much more fascinating. We're looking at the invisible machine that quite literally defeated exhaustion itself.
All right, let's just dive right into this. Picture yourself in a muddy, freezing foxhole in the Hurton Forest. It's November 1944. Imagine you're a German veteran named Willy Mueller, and you've been in uniform for 5 brutal years. You're crouched in this waterlogged trench, looking through your field glasses, and you're staring at American forces that simply defy reality. From Mueller's perspective, these Americans, they always had fresh faces. They had clean uniforms, boundless energy. They looked exactly like men who had actually slept the night before and eaten a hot meal that morning. It was this massive mystery that haunted German veterans for decades. Why did American troops never seem to look tired?
To really grasp how crazy this was, we gotta look at what Mueller was dealing with compared to the Americans just across the line. Mueller's unit, the 275th Infantry, was basically scraped from the absolute bottom of the barrel. We're talking patched together with Luftwaffe clerks and teenage conscripts. They hadn't seen hot food in 9 days. Meanwhile, right across the stream, the American 22nd Infantry looks like they had just arrived straight from a training camp. But here's the absolute kicker. They hadn't just arrived. They had actually been fighting brutally for months. And here is the incredibly brutal math behind that. The American 22nd Infantry wasn't magically avoiding the horrors of combat, no way. In fact, their losses were downright catastrophic. In just 18 days of fighting in that forest, the regiment suffered casualties equal to 151% of their original strength. Just take a second to think about what that number actually means. They lost literally every single rifleman they started with, replaced them, and then lost a huge chunk of those replacements too. Yet despite that devastating 151% turnover rate, the regiment never fell below 75% of its authorized strength. Not even once. The American regiment bled and refilled like a heartbeat. They pulled in nearly 2,000 replacements straight into active foxholes, sometimes literally overnight. So, to the Germans watching from the other side, who, by the way, couldn't replace their own fallen men at all, this created the utterly terrifying illusion of an army that was completely inexhaustible. Section 2. The logistics of morale. So, to uncover exactly how this wild illusion was sustained, we really have to look right behind those frontline rifles and examine what we can basically call the infrastructure of morale. The contrast in daily, basic survival was just staggering. Americans were getting hot coffee, scrambled powdered eggs, and canned bacon delivered right to the front in these insulated Mermite cans that kept the food piping hot for hours. The Germans, they were surviving on cold, 3-day-old dark bread and ersatz coffee. And this contrast isn't just about counting calories. Military psychiatrists actually studied this and noted that a hot meal meant the entire system was working. It told the soldier, hey, you haven't been forgotten. The Americans were serving an absolutely astonishing 4 million hot meals daily in Europe just to keep that psychological lifeline completely intact. But of course, those hot meals and endless bullets didn't just magically poof into existence. They rode in on the Red Ball Express. This was a colossal, completely invisible supply chain. We're talking about a continuous, one-way highway loop driven 24 hours a day, largely by segregated black units who were driving up to 20 hours a single shift. They moved 400,000 tons of material using 6,000 trucks. The frontline infantryman, he just knew his ammunition was there. He was totally unaware of the insane 300-mile relay race that brought it all the way from the Cherbourg port straight to his foxhole under mortar fire. And it gets crazier because the Americans even went so far as to literally weaponize cleanliness. They deployed these Quartermaster fumigation and bath companies right behind the front lines. A soldier could walk out of the mud, hand over his filthy uniform, take a hot shower in a tent, and walk out the other side in a clean, sterilized, pressed uniform of the exact correct size. Unlike the German soldier who was pretty much trapped in a single lice-infested, soaking wet uniform for months on end, the American soldier could be systematically refreshed. It was pure, calculated engineering applied directly to human morale. Moving on to the fuel that won. Now, the true breaking point of this massive logistical disparity, it manifested spectacularly during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944.
Right, so Hitler launches his last great gamble, pushing his absolute elite armored units through the Ardennes. But the spearhead, led by Joachim Peiper, well, they only had enough fuel to get halfway to their objective. So on December 17th, the most feared armored column in the entire German military overran an American dump in Billingen and was forced to stop fighting entirely. Why? Because they literally had to act as a gas station crew. They spent an hour just pumping captured American gasoline so they could keep moving. Their own supply chain was just utterly, hopelessly broken. This quote right here really hits the nail on the head. The items the Germans never had enough of? Not tanks, not guns, jerry cans, fuel. See, the war wasn't just decided by armor thickness. It was decided by sheer abundance. Because the Americans had the trucks, the fuel, and this pristine logistical network, they achieved the impossible. They literally turned General Patton's entire army of 150,000 men 90 degrees in the dead of winter in just 48 hours to counterattack the Germans. That is mind-blowing. The Germans simply didn't have the fuel or the trucks to even dream of attempting a maneuver like that. All right, Marshall's 90 Division gamble. To really understand the blueprint behind this endless river of men and material, we actually need to zoom out from those freezing European forests all the way back to General George Marshall's office in Washington, D.C. So Marshall was faced with fighting a massive global war, supplying allies across the world, and, oh yeah, building the atomic bomb. He had to make a really radical choice. He decided to cap the entire United States Army at roughly 90 divisions. Now, that number seems shockingly low, especially when you look at the stats and realize Germany fielded over 300, and the Soviet Union fielded over 500. So how on earth could just 90 divisions win a massive ground war in Europe? Well, the secret lay in Marshall's absolute genius for organization. He kept those 90 divisions permanently full. By 1944 and 45, a typical German division might exist entirely on paper, right? Just completely hollowed out to maybe 6,000 or 8,000 men. But an American division? It remained an absolute juggernaut of over 14,000 men. Instead of raising brand new units and letting the older ones just wither away like the Germans did, Marshall created this constant, massive river of individual replacements. This is what kept his 90 divisions at maximum lethal capacity. The brutal human cost. Now, this magnificent war-winning industrial machine, it had a pretty devastating twist hidden at the very bottom of its gears. The system had a cost, for sure, and it was paid directly by the soldiers themselves. Welcome to the Repel Deppels. That was the bitter, cynical nickname the soldiers gave to replacement depots. The whole system that produced this grand illusion of fresh, untiring troops, it treated these replacement soldiers not as human beings, but literally as inventory. They were collected, sorted by their serial numbers, and then shipped forward to the front lines as solitary bodies. Just individual gears meant to fill numerical slots in completely shattered squads. And right here, we uncover a seriously chilling historical irony. The German replacement system, despite obviously being part of a horrific regime, was functionally humane to its soldiers. Men from the exact same town trained together, they fought together, and if a unit was destroyed, the survivors were actually sent home to rebuild it together. But the democratic American system, it operated like a cold, unfeeling factory floor. Men were treated as isolated, interchangeable components. They were shipped entirely alone to squads where they knew absolutely no one. American military psychiatrists eventually discovered a very hard limit to human endurance. They found that the absolute maximum limit before an average American infantryman completely broke down mentally was about 200 to 240 continuous days in combat. And the thing is, unlike the British, who regularly rotated their men out for rest, American soldiers were very often just kept right on the line for weeks or even months on end without a break. So what exactly happened when those seasoned veterans finally broke or were killed? Well, they were replaced by teenagers who had never even heard a shot fired in anger. One veteran heartbreakingly described the experience of being a replacement as being, quote, a spare part, stamped, shipped, and installed. These isolated replacements, dumped into freezing foxholes with complete strangers in the dead of night, they broke way faster than the veterans did. In fact, so many of them became casualties before anyone in their new squad even had time to learn their first name. Just think about that for a second. The unit was effectively a giant ship of Theseus. It kept the exact same name, the same shoulder patch, the same flag. But underneath all that, it was constantly being rebuilt with terrified 19-year-olds who absorbed the immense psychological and physical damage required to keep the division at full strength. Willy Mueller, that German veteran we talked about earlier, he was wrong to think American soldiers were unwearable.
The American individual soldier was just as breakable as the German soldier. It was the system that was inexhaustible.
So, as we finally step out of the foxhole today, we really have to ask ourselves a pretty heavy question. If winning an industrial war requires treating your soldiers as perfectly interchangeable gears, what is the ultimate moral cost of building an unwearable machine out of extremely breakable men? It's a profound, sobering price for victory. And I highly encourage you to look a bit deeper into the explainer source materials to read up on the personal stories of these replacement soldiers who quite literally fueled that incredible machine. Thanks for exploring this with us.